Brian Windhorst went on TV after the Andrew Wiggins epic Game 5 performance. And we might actually talk about this when Mo DeKeel is going to come on the podcast tomorrow. So I won't go too deep into it, but he called it Game 5 a checkbook win for the Warriors because they were able to pay Andrew Wiggins and Clay and Draymond and Steph. And this is something, it's not unique to Windhorst saying that or hearing it. We even saw, I think in the original article that Zach Lowe published recently on the Warriors, like there was the quote about rivals are grumbling about their competitive advantage in their spending. I just don't, and I'm not saying Lowe buys into that. It seemed like Windhorst buys into that, but I don't want to necessarily, he said it. He's not the only one who's saying it though, is my point. Like we got to stop this. And I'm very much, people as I'm recording this are mad on Twitter because ESPN is talking about whether Anthony Davis is still a top 7 player in the NBA when we just had the epic Game 5 NBA Finals. There are two things here. There's actual coverage that is detrimental or misses the point. And I think saying the Warriors are a checkbook win only falls under that category because other teams, they can spend. Like, if you want to talk about the limitations of a market, it's not actually spending. It's how can you acquire talent that's worth spending on? And we know that free agency is not a realistic avenue for a team like Memphis or New Orleans for the most part. You have to get players via the draft or be willing to roll the dice via trade. We just saw New Orleans do that with CJ McCollum. And we've seen other teams do that. OKC acquiring Paul George, the Raptors going after Kawhi Leonard, and he left after a year. If you want to talk about those disadvantages, it's a separate issue. When it comes to spending, and the situation specifically to the Warriors, let's look at most of the players they're paying. There's no rule that's preventing other teams from drafting Steph Curry and Draymond Green and Klay Thompson and keeping them long enough to where they get so expensive they inflate your tax bill to kingdom come. There's nothing preventing teams from finding Jordan Poole, who's due for a lucrative extension. I think but what about Kevin Durant argument? I get it. There was a 73-win team that already had a title, and they added a top 10 player of all time in his prime. That, again, was not the Warriors' witchcraft or getting an exception to sign a current top 5 superstar without having cap space. There was an infusion of TV money at once in an unprecedented fashion rather than smoothing it over time. And that allowed the Warriors and other teams all this flexibility. In theory, other teams could have used that flexibility, which, by the way, the Warriors still had to get rid of Harrison Barnes, who they drafted, to make that happen. Other teams, in theory, could have done that. And if you're saying, well, yeah, was Kevin Durant never going to go to Denver? Okay, fine. But now we're talking about a market limitation, not a flexibility limitation. And I also don't want to hear about how team governors, ownership groups won't spend. When Forbes did their list of valuations to close out 2021, the Grizzlies were what do you call it, the cheapest franchise or like the lowest valued franchise, and they were still worth $1.5 billion. The fact that fandom, that an aspect of it, is conditioned to care about the pockets of billionaires or billionaire entities is just mind-boggling to me. I get that it's a part of roster building and we need to factor it in. I just spent time talking about why the Nuggets might have dumped JaMychal Green to lower their tax bill, make it more likely that they spend elsewhere. I'm not going to celebrate them for that, but you can understand that logic, understand that it's a reality of life without celebrating it, and also turning that Warriors victory and their place right now in the league, their dynasty overall, into something it's not. Their teams weren't complaining when they traded for Andrew Wiggins or even used Kevin Durant to get D'Angelo Russell. A lot of people thought that Russell contract was terrible. Everyone thought that Andrew Wiggins contract was terrible. The Warriors won the Andrew Wiggins trade at first because of that pick they got from Minnesota. Are you going to be mad at Minnesota for giving up that pick? Do we stop Golden State from making trades? I don't understand. You can also just even argue that Golden State's spending is prohibitive, just because look at how much time Klay Thompson missed. Look at how topsy-turvy is the word I use for Draymond Green on offense. A lot of people around the league are not going to view those as net positive assets, and the value that those two have added in the playoffs, they're not going to say that those are net positive contracts. The Warriors have to rely on Otto Porter Jr., Gary Payton II, who are on minimum deals. They had Andre Iguodala on a minimum deal. Did they get lucky because they had ties with Andre Iguodala or because he wanted to play there or that he was available for them on the minimum? Sure. Even Nemanja Bjelica in the regular season played a nice role for them. You can also argue that as much as the gap period helped them, they whiffed on what should have been the single biggest asset from that gap year, which was the number 2 pick in 2020. James Wiseman, still a mystery, but only because he's appeared in just 39 games through his first 2 seasons. The Warriors are here in spite of different reasons, because of a multitude of reasons, but they're mainly here because they were fortunate or lucky, however you want to phrase it, to get really good players. And then they were smart enough to keep those good players and acquire other good players. That is not a competitive advantage. That is something that is accessible to every NBA team. And if it's not, if you're not willing to spend, you shouldn't have control of an NBA team. And like controlling an NBA team should be seen as a privilege at this point. It can't be the fucking Lakers where that's your primary source of income. The Lakers didn't need to lowball Alex Caruso in free agency last summer or apply for a small business loan. That was still hysterical and sad and hopeless, pathetic, really. The Bucks, even, they have, I think they're fourth. They're going to have the 4th highest tax bill this season. And they went into the tax as a smaller market coming off a championship year. Good for them. They still could have kept PJ Tucker. Just because you did one doesn't excuse you from doing the other. Sometimes it is that simple. And yet we're oversimplifying why the Warriors are here at all. And we're deviating from like what this finals has become about. These two hellacious defensive teams where they're countering each other. They feel like they're on a collision course for a potential game 7. If not, like these games haven't always been great. There's been these lopsided quarters and stretches and even some finishes, but we're also sort of watching in X's and O's or functional classic in many respects. And even if you want to turn it into like the individual narratives, which is fine, that's part of everything. Like Kevon Looney going from seldom available to the 3rd best player on the Warriors in a final series right now, because that's what he's been, at least the 3rd most consistent player. Who's been more valuable than Kevon Looney to the Warriors this finals, aside from Steph or Andrew Wiggins? It's not Draymond. I don't really think it's been Clay. If you want to make a case for, I mean, Gary Payton II hasn't played enough, like even ditto for Otto Porter at this point. We should be talking about the transformative performance from Andrew Wiggins, which was brought to you by science, by the way. You want a COVID-19 vaccination success story. Andrew Wiggins went from potentially his future with the team is just up in the air. Everyone's pissed at him. Even Steph Curry was kind of pissed at him in the press conference. Won't get vaccinated, gets vaccinated, becomes an all-star starter, and now has been the 2nd best player for what will likely be the championship team as of now, because they're ahead 3-2 in the series against the Celtics. And statistically, that means they're probably going to win the title. We can talk about all that. I actually wrote about Andrew Wiggins as well. So go check that out at Bleacher Report. Let me selfishly plug my own work there. So we don't have to just lose, like, I'm fine with the extra crews, but we can't always just deviate from the plot entirely. Or I guess we don't have to make this into something it's not. And I'm not touting Warriors like Joe Lacob and co. Like, okay, yes, Steve Ballmer, they spent. Like, that needs to be acknowledged. I'm not going to applaud them for it, but I do think the Clippers specifically, they ended up shaving off some of the money with the Serge Ibaka trade, but they went out and got Norman Powell in a season that was just lost relative to championship expectations. That's what you want to see. Like, it should be an obligation when you have this type of title window open to do what the Clippers are doing, even if it's planning for next season, to do what the Warriors have done. Even when the opportunity to get Kevin Durant presented itself, hey, they jumped on the opportunity to get Kevin Durant. That's not unfair. It's, if you want to say it's unfair that that avenue was available to them in the first place, it's on the league, it's on the players union for not smoothing out that infusion of TV money. And look, I criticize the Warriors for not spending their taxpayers mid-level exception this past summer. A lot of people did. Had their season gone belly up because they didn't sign another big or a better big or spent on a better wing, like if Otto Porter Jr. doesn't pan out or Iguodala doesn't give them just enough, they don't stumble into Gary Payton II, then yeah, they would be under the microscope too. They're going to be under the microscope as well if they decide not to pay Looney, unrestricted free agent, who they have his full bird rights, so they can re-sign him for whatever. Or if they elect to play hardball with Jordan Poole's extension, or start moving other players, other salaries, maybe even including letting Looney go, so that they can quote unquote afford his extension. This is not, when it comes to paying players, yeah, there are limitations in play. Like the tax penalties are supposed to be punitive because that's going to fuel the competitive parity. But if you're willing to pay it, as you should be, if you were in charge of an NBA team and have that type of opportunity in front of you, that's not unfair. It's not a checkbook victory. The Warriors have good players. They were lucky to get a lot of those players. They have the Timberwolves to thank for a few of those players and passing on Steph Curry and trading Andrew Wiggins, then also giving them Jonathan Kuminga. So yes, there are levels to why Golden State is here. It's not savvy front office wizardry. It's not Joe Lacob and friends. It's not even just Steph Curry. The Warriors are more than Steph Curry, although they're made possible by Steph Curry more than anyone. There's a multitude of reasons the Warriors are here. And like, let's not lose sight of that.